I never tell anyone this story, but reading all the stories on here I feel like I need to post about it. Because of this I don't go on walks alone or even with friends unless it's in a very public place. But even then I am paranoid. With that being said, my friend's family had just moved to a new town 15 minutes from where I lived. It was a complete ghost town, with one tiny grocery store, a post office, and a school. This town was so secluded and quiet I rarely ever saw cars drive by. One night, as we were unpacking boxes, we heard a knock at the door. It was a big tall man with a shotgun in his hands. Being from Oklahoma, this could mean you're either meeting your hick new neighbor or it's actually someone wanting to harm us. Turns out it was just a hick neighbor coming to introduce himself. He told my friend's mom about the lack of police and how everyone tends to carry their own guns in order to protect themselves because the police were usually no help and 15 minutes away. He also talked about how these areas can be dangerous and that my friend's mom should keep a gun with her. At this time I was 13 years old, and knowing this information, you would think I would simply stay my ass inside and not wander the streets of this dangerous hillbilly ghost town, but I did. There was no service, no cable, and nothing to do but go outside. We would walk to the store and get snacks, walk to the school and play on the playground. Majority of the time we wouldn't see a single car or person but the same clerk in the grocery store on every walk we took. There was a day my dad had brought me to her house, and right off the bat we walked to the park. That day I was sick to my stomach, but was so eager to go see my friend I went anyways. I had a terrible feeling, and now that I'm older and have experienced bad anxiety, I can now say that day I was experiencing some pretty bad anxiety, and I didn't know why I felt this way. When we got there, we actually ended up hanging out with an old friend who had transferred to this school a year prior. After he left, we sat on the bench for what felt like ages, taking selfies and talking, when all of a sudden the stereotypical creepy van pulls up to the park. Now my friend was and still is way braver than I was and will ever be, and she was always the daredevil one in our friendship. But for some reason, around this time I just assumed it was a family coming to play, and my anxiety was gone. But my friend was scared. She immediately had a bad feeling when the van pulled up, and I could tell she was ready to leave. But we decided to stay and see who it was before we just ran off. Of course, like something out of a movie, came out two big men literally barreling over to where we were. We immediately started to walk away, and they tried to follow and grab us. At this point, we began to run. They got back into the van and followed us. I have no idea how, but they didn't catch up to us, but we ran as fast as we would up the road and straight to the grocery store. I was so horrified when we got inside I couldn't even speak. That sick feeling I felt on the way to my friend's house made complete sense. My mom was always watching true crime growing up, and sometimes she would have me watch with her, so I was always really scared to walk around because of that. But even with that fear, I never thought it would never happen to me. The van was parked across the street, but eventually drove off. We walked home with no way to call anyone, thinking they could be waiting for us around every corner with absolutely no one around. It was the scariest day of my life. I didn't tell anyone for years, which was stupid of me, but at 13 years old I didn't know what to do. I'm turning 21 soon, and this story still keeps me up at night sometimes. I can't help but imagine what would have happened if they captured me and my friend, where we would have gone, and what would have happened to us. This happened 16 years ago, but it stayed with me, both because it terrified me and because I still feel like an idiot. I live in Honduras, which has more than its fair share of problems. Violence and poverty being the top of the list. So you kind of grow up with messed up stuff being normalized. One of them is families marrying off their daughters to rich suitors. Sometimes it's putting peer pressure on the daughter to be open to the advances of some rich prick, and other times it feels like outright sexual trafficking. Especially in families where either mom or dad are not in the picture. More common in small towns, but not unheard of in bigger places. Growing up, me and my siblings were shielded from the nastier things that happen here because our parents busted their humps to put us in good schools, live in a relatively safe place, and raised us to be cautious and not go where we're not supposed to. My mom owned a cafe in a port, so a lot of her clients were tourists and foreigners who stopped en route to their villas or beach houses. One of them was this older American who, through chit-chatting a few times, ended up getting along with my parents, even inviting our whole family once to a cookout in his beach house. He was always nice and friendly and gave off a sweet vibe. He even kind of looked like Santa Claus. So one day when I was taking his order, he asked me to sit down with him. He asked me about school, my goals once I graduated, and no alarm went off in my head because I figured he was bored and wanted to chat with somebody before my mom came back from her break. Then things took a bad turn. He commented about knowing about my family's recent hardships, mainly about debts and dad not being able to work due to an accident. I nod along, figuring that my parents asked him for help or a loan or something. He then says he was talking about them having me go with him back to the States since I have a visa and helping him out while living with him. He made some comments about my looks, said everybody would rather wait until I graduated, which was still a few months away, but that my family needed help now and it wouldn't appropriate for him to step in if they weren't his family. So if we went off and got married soon, he'd take care of everybody. I was stupefied and basically just murmured out something that was like, "No thank you, sir." He said I didn't have to decide right away, but that we should go on a trip in his boat this weekend to see if we get along. He claimed my parents were conflicted but decided not to tell me anything because they wanted me to finish school and then choose for myself. But he flipped that on me, saying I was the oldest, I needed to look out for my siblings, and that my parents had taken care of me and I needed to take care of them. At this point, I felt a pit in my stomach because I believed he really did speak with them about taking me away and they really were thinking about it. Instead of telling to fuck himself, I started kind of negotiating, saying if so and so could come with me on the weekend boat trip and if I could finish high school over in the States and so forth. All while holding back tears. He calmed me down and told me my parents already said no, but that I should really think about it and wait for them to bring it up. And he made me promise not to tell them that he'd already given me the heads up. That it was important that I prove to him that he could trust me. Turns out he was full of shit. He brought the idea up to my parents 2 days after he had told me. My mom instantly shut it down and that he insisted she should ask me for my opinion, and my mom told him she wouldn't bother because I was going to finish school, go to college, and then I could do what I wanted with my life. This was during dinner, 2 full days after the talk with that old man, and I started bawling, telling them that he had said this and that and not to tell anybody. So yeah, I felt like the biggest idiot in the world for thinking my parents would just hand me away like a sack of potatoes, but God, did I feel relieved. So wherever you are, creepy Santa, let's not meet again. Some context first. This story took place in 2020, when I was 18 years old. I lived in a relatively safe neighborhood, but my country does have a high crime rate in general, so take that with a pinch of salt. My dad had passed away earlier in the year, and I had no siblings, so my mom and I lived alone in our house. The COVID lockdowns were still in place, but as certain restrictions were lifted, people were starting to return to work. Between my house and the train tracks was a stretch of empty field. It became a safe, quiet space for me to escape to whenever I needed to get out of the house. I would normally sit there once a day for a cigarette or two, sometimes for a little picnic. My home situation was complicated, to say the least, and due to the pandemic, I had nowhere else to go. On this particular day, I went there for a few minutes to smoke, as always. I was about halfway through my cigarette when I noticed a young man walking along the train tracks on the other side of the field. He was barefoot and wearing dirty, worn-out clothes. He noticed me and made a hand gesture suggesting that he was asking for a smoke. I should have just left, but as a teenager, I found it difficult to say no to people. I walked across the field and handed him a smoke. He took it from me, and I immediately felt uneasy with the way he was looking at me. He asked me, "Don't you live in that house over there?" and pointed at my house. I avoided answering the question, and at this point realized that I needed to leave. I had left from my front gate that day. For him to know where I lived, he must have watched me leave from the back gate before. I told him I needed to get going. He started insisting on giving me a hug to say thank you, and I declined several times. At this point, I turned around and started walking away quickly. I didn't get very far. He caught up to me and put his arm around my waist. I panicked, not knowing what to do. All I could think of was that I needed to get away. As I tried to start running, he grabbed me from behind and started dragging me toward the row of houses where the view from the road is completely blocked. The fences were high too, so no one could see the field from their backyards. We were completely isolated. I was kicking and struggling, desperate to get out of his grasp. He ended up throwing me on the ground, with him on top of me, still holding on. In a split second, my life flashed before my eyes. That feeling that something terrible was about to happen came over me. I couldn't escape, he was too strong. My arms were trapped by his, and he was holding me down, so I couldn't kick him. I did the only thing left to do, and I started screaming for help. Suddenly I was free. I could move. He had let go and jumped off of me. He ran away. My heart was still pounding. I was shaking in shock from what had just happened. He disappeared into the industrial area on the other side of the train tracks. I immediately ran towards the road. As I reached it, I noticed it was empty. There were no cars parked in my neighbor's driveways. No one heard me screaming, and had he realized, that day could have had a far worse ending. He knew where I lived, and I was terrified of him returning. For months, I had panic attacks and nightmares, and I could barely leave my house without breaking down. I moved away from there a year later, but I still sometimes get scared when I'm home alone or walking around town. Thankfully, I never saw him again, and I hope that I never will.